Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2008. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and it's my honor today to talk to Janet Roney.
Roney. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that before the interview to make sure I pronounced it right. Janet Roney.
That's right.
Janet is the daughter of Charles Shuman, and that's Schumann, and that's very much what we're going to be talking about. But we wanted to have the opportunity to learn a lot more about the family history and how they ended up here in the Sullivan area in Illinois as well. So, Janet, what I'd like to have you start with is probably a question you didn't want to answer.
Oh.
Tell me your date of birth and where you were born.
It's not a problem. I'm proud to be 66 years old. I was born March 17th, 1942 at Decatur, Illinois, in the hospital. One of the first of our generation, of our family generation, to actually be born in a hospital. Prior to that, everyone was born at home.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up southeast of Sullivan on the family farm.
Is that where we're sitting right now?
That is near where we're sitting. This is part of the family farm, but it is not the center of operations or the original farm.
Okay, and your parents' name?
My father was Charles Baker Shuman, or Charles B. Schumann, and my mother was Ida Wilson.
Okay. What we'd like to do now, because I know that you are the family historian, and we always like to talk to the family historian, so walk us way to the back of this nation's history and how the Schumans got here.
Well, it is like almost any family, really. We all, if we have a family that's been here for several generations, if you are interested, especially today, you can find so many things about your origins if you only take time to look. We have been fortunate in my family to have a series of people who, in the different generations, who liked to pass down stories. And in fact, I had a great grandmother who was quite proud of her family history, and so therefore it came down word of mouth.
What was her name?
Her name was Mary McFeeters Schumann.
Okay.
Our family, one of the earliest origins of our family came from Virginia. The first one that had some kind of notoriety was a man named Isaac Bowman. He was a Revolutionary War soldier. He lived in the mountains near northern part of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and he had an older brother who was acquainted with George Rogers Clark, and Clark came through the valley trying to find soldiers for his Illinois expedition that Jefferson had just given him permission to do. And the sum of it was when his older brother Joseph Bowman, who became Clark's second in command, joined Clark's party, Isaac came too. So Isaac and his brother Joseph and many, many cousins and close relatives were in George Rogers Clark's party. Now the reason that's important is twofold. Clark and his men were the ones who secured Illinois and all the Northwest Territory. They were able to secure Kaskaskia and Cahokia, and then eventually Vincennes. And when the peace treaty was signed at the end of the Revolutionary War, then all of this territory west of the mountains new United States had a claim to that because of Clark. So my great, I think I've forgotten how many great-grandfathers it goes back, but anyway, it's several generations back.
Yeah, he was born from what your record said, 1757. So
1757, yes. Well, the upshot of that was, as a Revolutionary War veteran, he finally received compensation from the new government of the United States, and among them were several acres of land in the north of Louisville, Kentucky, and southern Indiana. Through the generations, then, that property was maintained within the family and also sold, but the capital was kept together, and ultimately it part of his assets, of Isaac Bowman's assets, went to his granddaughter, who married a man named Addison McFeeters. And Addison McFeeters was the first man of my family, first generation of my family to come to this part of Illinois and purchase this family farm. And that was in 1853 when Addison McFeeters and Isaac Bowman's granddaughter came to settle here. Okay. So does that give you a little bit of the origins?
That's a great start to it. And do you know where McFeeters, was he coming from a different location in the United States?
Yeah, his family early part goes back to Virginia also, but Augusta County, Virginia, which is a little bit south of where the Bowmans came from. And his ancestors came into Kentucky also at a very early age, as did the Bowmans. But his family well, he himself did not have very many assets. And as a young man in 1819, he strikes out on his own, goes to Missouri, takes up land in Missouri when it was just before it was a state, and signs up with the Black Hawk War from Missouri. He has a wife by this time. Eventually she dies, and he goes back to Kentucky to kind of reestablish himself, and then marries into this Bowman, marries the Bowman granddaughter.
Is that Susan?
That is Susan. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I see that he's got a title of Major Addison.
Yes, he
was. So
was
that from the
Black Hawk War. He left. The reason we know quite a bit about him, he left a journal, right? He wrote it, must have been 5 or 6, 10 years at the most before he passed away. And he told about some of his experiences in the Black Hawk War. He did not have active action. He was mainly just maneuvered around guarding in the southeastern Iowa area and northwestern Missouri area.
Well, I wonder if you know enough about him to know his views about slavery. He's the son of Kentucky, if you will. He moves into an area of Illinois which is heavily populated by people from Kentucky and Virginia and places like that.
Right. Yes, I know quite a bit about. In fact, I've spent a lot of time searching out his attitude. He mentions briefly in his journal about his attitude, but he doesn't dwell on it a lot. I know enough from other things, other letters and so forth, to know that he was an avid anti-slavery man. I'm not sure I can call him an abolitionist, because as far as I know, he did not do active, he wasn't a part of an organized abolitionist movement, but he was very much opposed to slavery. He had seen what it had done in Virginia. Well, he was not born in Virginia, but his family came from a slaveholding area in Virginia. His uncle, his mother's brother, was a large landowner in Kentucky. His name was Wardlaw, in the Lexington, Kentucky area, and he had a large number of slaves. And when his uncle died, Addison, my great-great-grandfather, was his executor. And in the will of his uncle James Wardlaw, was the direction that all of his slaves should be freed and sent to Liberia. It was part of the Back to Africa movement. If they were not willing to leave and go to Liberia to start a new life, then they were not to be freed. But as far as I know from Addison's writing, he says that most of them took up this offer, and he heard from many of them years later. He carried on a correspondence with them, and I would give anything to have those letters, but they've not been kept or not been found. But anyway, when he came to, one of the reasons he left Kentucky, he had gone back and, as I said, married his second wife. Her family was also a slaveholding family. Yeah, her maiden name was Richardson. So Addison was bucking his own family tradition. He was not in agreement with his own father-in-law. Eventually, he and his wife decided to come to Illinois because the father-in-law had purchased land up here in the Coles County area. So when Addison and Susan, his wife, came to the area of Coles County, they discovered that it was not only near his wife's siblings, who were mostly Copperhead or I mean, in those days they were very much pro-slavery. This was before the Civil War. Anyway, the sum of it is that when they got to Coles County, they realized they were in the area of Coles County that was the most pro-slavery in the whole county. It was a hotbed of pro-slavery people, including his relatives. So they sold their land in Coles, and he came over to Moultrie County, which is the neighboring county, and purchased the land that now is our family home. So it probably, if he had not been anti-slavery, he would have probably stayed in Coles County on the family land that his father-in-law had purchased for him.
But my impression is that this is better land here than Coles County.
That is a factor also. My husband and I found the land that Addison and Susan, well, it was Susan's land, you must understand. It was given to Addison's wife. And in those days, the wife didn't have a lot to say about things. She, yes, inherited it, but Addison, I'm sure, made the decisions about it. Anyway, my husband and I found this plot of land, and it happened to be after a big rain one June day, and that it was like in this big kettle hole, this 200 acres of just total, a big 200-acre pond that had corn growing in it, but the water was about 2 feet high. And so there were other factors. Now, I can't say that Moultrie County land in general was better than that land, but the other factor, the land in Coles County was not too close to a wooded area, but this was, and this farm that we lived on had about 70 or so acres of timber on it.
Do you have any ancestors who fought in the Civil War?
Yes. Well, I do on my mother's side, a direct ancestor, but Addison McFeeters, by his first wife, had 2 sons who went to the Civil War and fought 2 different units. The Addison Jr. was in the 21st Illinois, which was Grant's regiment, and Rankin was in the 126th, and he attained, he was a captain eventually in that unit. My great-great-grandfather, Addison McFeeters, the first one to the farm, wrote quite an active correspondence with his sons in the war, and we do have all those letters, about 120 letters, both from the home front and to the boys in the service, and then from the 2 Civil War soldiers back to the home front, and it's quite an interesting account.
Well, I would imagine the one who's in the 21st, the older brother. I mean, his name again?
They were twins.
They were twins.
His name was Addison Jr.
Okay. So Addison Jr. being in the 21st, and with Grant, so he was in all those major Western campaigns.
Yes, until I think the last one that he was involved in, I think he went as far as the Murfreesboro battle. But at some point he got the dysentery and became, had to go to hospital, had to be removed. So he didn't go on down into the Vicksburg campaign at all.
Oh, he didn't make, but he was at Shiloh?
No, he did not get to Shiloh.
Oh, okay, okay.
I think he was before, let's see, should have looked that up for sure, but I think that's...
Okay.
But Rankin was in the 126th, they eventually ended up at Vicksburg with the Army, and were involved in that siege.
Did he see some action following Vicksburg?
After Vicksburg, he went back up to, I think they were posted in Arkansas area, kind of guarding the mouth of one of the rivers that comes into the Mississippi.
The Red River?
I believe it might have been. But he never wrote in any of these letters about his action, any action. I'm sure he had it, but
The Red River campaign was not a very illustrious campaign.
No, no.
Okay, now I know that the Schumann name comes to Illinois at the same time, does it not?
Well, it was a little later, about 10 years later. And let's see, Addison McFeeters came up from Kentucky and came into Moultrie in 1853 and had the two sons farming. When those two boys went off to war, Addison was without as much help on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And a young man, the story goes in the family, came wandering along and looking for work. And the story is, well, his name was Charles Shuman.
And this would have been during the Civil War when the sons were gone?
During the Civil War, maybe just immediately prior to the Civil War. But at any rate, he comes upon the scene here in Moultrie. Now, he had been born in Philadelphia in 1843. His father was a German immigrant shoemaker. And he was, I think, of very modest means. The father and his mother had brought their family west. They had lived in Louisville, Kentucky for a while, and then they ended up at Dudley, Illinois. And the family story is that the shoemaker father, would be my great-great-grandfather Schumann.
What a perfect name. And that didn't happen by accident.
No, I'm sure they were a long line of shoe cobblers. Well, his father made a statement to his sons. Prospects aren't too good around here at Dudley. That was over in Edgar County. You need to go west. Mm-hmm. I'll make each of you a pair of shoes, and you go west as far as the shoes last. And when they wear out, you stop and take up your life. That's the family story. Now, our dear great-grandfather, Charles Shuman, did not get very far because Dudley is not very far from Moultrie County. And but he came through at some point and made acquaintance with Addison McFeeters, and Addison hired him to be a farmhand. The letters show, in these Civil War letters, there's one that says, it's from Rankin's wife to Rankin in the field, well, Charlie and Mary are in love. So Mary was Addison's daughter. So Charles Shuman, the immigrant shoemaker's son, comes to be a farmhand and falls in love with a farmer's daughter. So I'm sure that happened many, many times, but that was the case in our family.
Well, it also interests me that he comes from a cobbler background, but finds a home on the farm.
He finds a home on the farm. I believe that he had done some farming in the Dudley area, the Edgar County area. He wasn't totally unacquainted with farming, but he was a very industrious man and apparently quite unusual in his talents and skills, and Addison recognized that.
How did it come that Mary and Charles then basically inherit the land?
Well, because the Major Addison McFeeters had two wives. His first two sons that were the Civil War veterans were the children of his first wife. Mary was the child of his second wife, the descendant of Isaac Bowman. Mm-hmm. And her grandfather had provided the capital for this family land. So it is my opinion that, well, as time went on, Major Addison acquired a lot of other land after he got here to Sullivan. He had a good start, after all, with this nucleus of farmland. He kept adding to it. As his sons became more mature, they also purchased land. So at one point, southeast here of Sullivan, I've never added up how many acres that Addison owned, but besides the home, what we now call the home place, there was a considerable acreage between here and Sullivan, and it went north beyond Route 121. Then he also owned some property up near where I live, between Lovington and Sullivan, north of town, quite a bit of acreage there. So there was enough assets that when the estate was divided, the other two sons that were the only ones really surviving into adulthood had their portion. And Mary, my great-grandmother, received the home place, which was really from her line, her mother's family line. So that's how it came down to her.
So it wasn't that the other sons were lacking. They
Oh,
got
no.
something as well.
Yes, yes. There was
Okay.
enough for all of them to be equally treated.
Well, I guess the next thing to do then is to take us from that time frame, just after the Civil War, up to the early 20th century.
Well, that's a really interesting time. I did not know either of my great-grandparents, but I've heard lots. They both passed on long before I was born. But this is now, I'm talking about Charles Shuman and his wife Mary McPheeters Schumann. Charles continued to work on the family, on the McPheeters land, and began to do some school teaching. There was a little country school up in the corner of the farm called Pisgah. It's no longer there, of course, and he, as I understand it, taught a couple of seasons there, farmed for McPheeters in the summer. But Mary was quite young, and they waited a long time before they got married. In the meantime, excuse me, it appears that Addison sees Charles as a good prospect for his daughter and sets about to encourage him in every way he could. He enabled Charles to go to Shelbyville, the town nearby where there was an academy where he graduated there, which would be similar to our high school today. Mm-hmm. And then Addison encourages Charles, what he sees as his future son-in-law, to go to college. And in the 1870s, to find a farm hand going to college is an extremely rare experience.
Yeah, it's amazing to me.
It is. And so the family story, once again, and I've never seen this verified in any writing other than my father's recollections. Addison gave Charles a flock of turkeys and told him to drive them to St. Louis and sell them, and then he could use the money from the turkeys to enter school at McKendree College in Lebanon. Now, you say, oh, that sounds just totally wild and ridiculous.
I'm conjuring up images of driving this flock of turkeys anywhere.
All right, the story is, and I have had this verified in an article I read, found some obscure book about driving turkeys in the East Coast. You could only take anywhere from 50 to 75 turkeys in a flock. And they were next to impossible to drive. You kind of had to just sort of let them find their way. And they went about 1 mile an hour. The turkeys, when it came time for nightfall, didn't matter where they were or where you wanted to stop. If there was a grove of trees nearby, within about a minute or two, they were all perched in the trees to roost for the night. Huh. The story we get is that great-grandfather Schumann would approach a farmhouse and, knowing it was about nighttime, decide to stop, and so they'd rest there and sleep there for the night. And when he left, sometimes the farmer's turkeys went with him. And by the time he got to St. Louis, he had many more turkeys than he started with, so he'd made a nice tidy profit. So he took the money and he went to Lebanon, which is just outside of St. Louis, to McKendree College, which was had been founded by the Methodist Church many, many years ago, prior to that. And he enrolled in college there, spent several, I'm not sure what year he enrolled, but I do know that he graduated in 1872. Then he came back and he stayed in that area and taught school in a country school on Looking Glass Prairie, which is near Lebanon. And then he got a little more training at Southern Illinois University for teaching purposes, got some teaching training. And then I was just reading recently that he got also his master's degree at McKendree College, which I had never processed that information. So he got his master's in 1875. He ends up back here in Sullivan. He marries Mary. He married Mary, that's hard to say, in 1874. So 1 year before he got his master's. And I really suspect, I don't know what Mary was doing while he was, whether he was doing it from a long distance or whether he actually left her, because I also read a reference that he did some teaching in Southern Illinois in 1876. So it's possible she was with him down there briefly, but I've never heard that mentioned. And then he comes back to Sullivan with Mary, and he does farming on the side, and he also teaches school. Eventually became the principal of the grade school, I assume, or the school system here in Sullivan. And then in let's see, let me think a minute, early part of the 1880s, I don't know whether it was 1880 or 1882, he ran for county clerk and became county clerk for Moultrie County. So he seems to have a strong desire to get ahead. But everything I've read about him, it was very kind of a, not a shy, but very quiet man, but determined, and everybody seemed to think he was very high, strong character.
It still amazes me, though, at a time when I would think that if you plan to have farming in your future, then an 8th grade education would have sounded like a lot. That maybe a lot of people were not even making it to the 8th grade. And then he's going on to college and to graduate school, for God's sakes.
I think he must have been especially gifted. And, I mean, we would call him a gifted student today, I guess. But I'm not certain that he ever had farming as his main goal, because it wasn't long that after this he's thinking of himself more as a businessman, I think, because he started what they call the Sullivan grain elevator, and I'm not sure which one that was. There used to be 3 elevators in Sullivan. I don't know which one it was. And then he went together after he got out of, he did 2 terms as county clerk, and then he started with a group of investors, what eventually became the First National Bank in Sullivan. And that is where he continued to thrive as far financially, I'm sure.
Okay. So let's get to the next generation then.
Okay. That's an interesting generation. Mary and Charles have 3 children who survived. Bertha is the oldest. The second oldest is Bliss, who was my grandfather, and the youngest is Irving, and they were born in late 70s, early 1880s. My grandfather was born in 1879. My grandfather's name, Bliss, comes from the last name of one of Charles Shuman's good friend at McKendree College. His last name was Charles. I believe it was Charles Bliss. His descendants still run a newspaper in Montgomery County. My grandfather was named after a college friend. It's a very unusual name. And so anyway, these 3 children were, I think, lived, I'm not sure when they moved from the farm. I think they were still living on the farm through part of that period. But then they moved to Sullivan, the family moved to Sullivan into a beautiful red brick home that my great-grandfather, Charles, had remodeled. More fitting as the local banker, I guess. I think they moved into that home in the 1890s. So those 3 children essentially grew up in the country part-time, and then in their later years in Sullivan. Bertha never married. She was a teacher in the local school system, and she was kind of a family genealogist historian. She kept a lot of these stories alive. She wrote down these stories and applied for various memberships in things like the DAR and stuff. So as a consequence, a lot of these stories are known because of her. Bliss, my grandfather, started farming. That's all he ever wanted to do, and he farmed the home place. Irving was a very talented, brilliant, handsome young boy. the favorite, the family favorite. My father always talked very openly about this. My grandfather, Bliss, was pretty shy and very quiet and not really as outgoing. In fact, not outgoing at all. I'm sure there would...
But it sounds like he followed his father in that respect.
Yes. He was a very steady person, hardworking. He loved to work, and so farming really suited him. Irving graduated. I am not certain that he graduated from high school, because I read somewhere where he quit school. He was out of high school by age 16. Now that could mean he advanced and got out early, or that he quit, but he went immediately to work in the bank for his father there at Sullivan. He was a charming person and had personality just dripping from him. He had a lot of gifts that we would see today as perfect for people in the public. And he soon got involved in, I'm talking about Irving now, he soon got involved in the Masonic organization big time, in banking circles. He was on various committees for the state banking organizations, and eventually he was a staunch Democrat and was a very early supporter of Woodrow Wilson. Now we're talking about a man about age 32 here, and see, 1912, that would be when Wilson was elected. Irving was born, I think, in 82, so we're 30 years old, I guess, when the convention for Wilson, or the Democratic Convention of 1912. So Irving becomes very involved in politics and is given some credit, quite a bit of credit actually, for that was a deadlock convention in 1912. I think they had 46 ballots and hadn't come to a resolution who they would nominate. In
an era where you still selected the candidates at the convention,
right,
quite unlike what we have now.
So Irving, along with a man named Stringer from Lincoln, Illinois, who was, I'm not quite sure his position in Wilson's campaign, but they did some wheeling and dealing, and eventually when the Illinois Illinois delegates, the Democratic Convention, switched to Wilson, it kind of confirmed the ball rolling down the hill towards Wilson. And Wilson gave, I guess, it's been credited that Illinois switch of votes to Wilson was what secured the nomination for Wilson. So Irving was rewarded then as being appointed as an assistant U.S. Treasurer, which in those days meant that you were the head of what would be a predecessor of the Federal Reserve banks, but he was the head of the sub-treasury, they called it in Chicago, for 3 or 4 years then, or it'd be more like, let's see, from 1912 to 1917 or so, something like that. And then Irving is quite colorful thereafter, and I'm not sure that you want to know all that.
Well, see, that's exactly what I want to know about. You know that.
He signed up for, if you want to hear some more.
A little bit more.
I won't go into all the details, but he had developed quite a few enemies by that time, and he quit as sub-treasurer and then got involved with a department store which went bankrupt in Chicago. And my dad always thought that he was just getting out of town when he signed up for service in World War I. Well, he was appointed with his skills. He was put into, he never saw action, but he got involved with, about the time he got in, the way I understand it, the war was about over, so they kept him as in helping dispersal of military supplies in Europe and some relief work. And he became financial advisor to Paderewski, who was considered the founder of Poland. Mm-hmm. About this time, he became interested in a woman, not his wife, who was a nurse and serving in the in the war. And they were eventually divorced. A great scandal ensued. Newspaper articles were published with letters from Irving when she sued for divorce. Great embarrassment to my great-grandmother, I'm sure, and tough times.
So was that his second marriage then?
It was his first marriage that he divorced, and then he married this nurse, and he even contemplated, now get this, in one of his letters, you see, at that time, the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917.
Mm-hmm.
And there was resistance. You may have heard the story of the White Army and the Red Army. Well, he, with his banking skills, he thought he might be able to help out in that situation in Russia, and contemplated. He did not do it, otherwise we might never have met Uncle Irving, but he did not go to Russia, but he seriously considered going to Russia to get involved in helping, I'm sure, the White Army or the government that they were trying to set up opposing the communists. So wouldn't that have been an interesting story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether this was from conviction of interest and sympathy towards the cause, or just putting a lot of space between him and his creditors by that time.
Well, I seem to recall that he had something to do with land purchase in Florida as well.
Yes, well, he came back with his wife. And my father says, now I don't know all of this, isn't written down in any kind of journal, but he came back, bless his heart, he had so many gifts, but he went through several different wives, and at one point he was living in Florida at the time of the land boom, Florida land boom, the late 20s, which when it went up, feet up, and had the panic, lots of people lost lots of money. He was an agent for a land development agency and probably involved in the leadership of it. He bragged to my grandmother once that he had once been worth $2 million, and she asked him, well, how much are you worth now? And he pulled out a few handfuls of change and a few bills and says, well, that's about it. I don't know what the amount was, but he went through several fortunes and lost them, and he would come back and ask help from his mother, which became to be quite an irritant in the family, of course. But he was very colorful. I met him twice. When my mother died, he came back for her funeral, and I thought, where has this man been? I never knew I had an Uncle Irving, and he enthralled my brothers and I with story after story of life when he was growing up here in Sullivan and experiences. He was quite a colorful person.
What did your grandfather think of him? Because they are such different personalities.
Well, I never heard an opinion from my grandfather. He was so quiet. He never cast judgment. I do know that my grandmother, my grandfather's wife, Grace, who I haven't talked about, did not think much of him, and was quite upset with the course his life had taken. And I think my great-grandmother, Mary, was very deeply troubled by his behavior in his later years. They were quite proud at the beginning, but...
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Bliss, and
Yes.
especially how your father and his siblings came along.
Bliss was the middle child of Charles and Mary Shuman, and Bliss married a neighbor girl, Grace Baker, who they were my grandparents and the parents of my father. And he farmed all of his life, as I said, very hardworking. Grace was a school teacher before they were married. In fact, our family has had lots of school teachers and lots of farmers, and it's kind of the family occupation.
We're getting a theme of both because you're sitting in front of
Yes.
a whole great collection of bells.
I didn't count how many school teachers I'm related to, but my sister-in-laws, I was a school teacher, but all three of my sister-in-laws on my side of the family were school teachers. My mother was a school teacher. Yeah. Artie has this marvelous collection back here.
And how many children did Bliss have?
Bliss had 3. My father was the oldest, Charles Baker Shuman, and the next one was Bernadine, who married Homer Curtis, and the last one was Mildred, who married Earl Hughes. Those were both men that my father introduced them to when he was at the University of Illinois.
Well, I think we need to move along and get to more about your father, Charles, because he's so important to American farm history and American history in general.
Mm-hmm.
He was born what year?
1907, a year in the farmhouse.
He grew up on the farm as well?
Grew up on the farm, spent most of his life on the farm until he went to college. And when he went to college, his second sibling, his younger sister Bernadine, who was a couple of years younger, was a brilliant woman and a young girl, and she had advanced in grade school. In the country schools in those days, you could jump ahead, and she started to school when my father started to school at age 4. They both skipped grades, and eventually, though, they both graduated together from Sullivan High School and both entered U of I at the same time. So my grandparents moved to Champaign-Urbana to be with them because she was so young when she entered U of I. So that's, yes, other than that, he lived all of his life here.
How would you describe your father, his personality?
He was...
more like Bliss or Irving?
He had the good qualities of both. He was not, he was grounded. He was very comfortable in his own skin. He knew who he was and what he stood for, and he was extremely ethical. Very strong character, very personable, and the quality that he had that many people who get some renown don't have, his fame never went to his head. He was still Charlie Shuman, the farmer from Sullivan, all his life. Mm-hmm. When he'd come home from being gone all week, see, every week when he was in Farm Bureau, he lived in Chicago in the Sherman House Hotel through the week, and then came home every weekend. As soon as he could, he'd put his his overalls on and go to town to see what was going on in town and get his hair cut, visited, gossip, do a little bit of gossiping, and he was just as common as an old shoe. He was a very unique character.
Was he working on his father's farm then?
Yes, he started farming on the Schumann family farm.
Did he eventually inherited that?
He and his sisters would have inherited it, but in advance of my grandparents' death, my father arranged to purchase the family farm from his parents, who then in turn gave cash gifts to his 2 sisters. So it was an arrangement where, and then Dad immediately put the land in trust from myself and my 3 brothers. Mm-hmm. So he did not inherit that land. He purchased it from his parents, and it was a way of doing some advanced estate planning even in the 1950s.
Yeah, I was thinking that was quite unusual for that time.
Yes, he was very up on what would be the best way to do things.
Was this in some respects trying to avoid the onerous aspects of inheritance law?
I'm not sure that was the only reason. I'm sure there was an aspect to that, yeah. Okay. Because I don't think they had the capital gains tax like we have today, but there were taxes, and it did skip a generation in essence. But that wasn't the only reason. Mm-hmm. He really wanted this land to stay together and as a unit, because he knew at that time my 3 brothers wanted to farm it. And if the family land had not been kept together, it just dispersed. I mean, it made it less likely that they would be able to be successful farmers. So if you had to, at some unknown time, purchase your from your sisters their inheritance, and maybe you wouldn't be able to do it. It might have to go up for auction. Who knows what would happen. So Dad, in advance, wanted to control how this happened so that land would have a stronger chance of staying as a unit.
And you said that happened in the 50s.
1954 was when the trust began, when my dad purchased it.
So we obviously have to go quite a bit back into that again, because he got involved in farm organizations very early in his adult life, did he not?
As soon as he got out of college, he came back to the farm and got involved in local community activities, of which included the Farm Bureau. And we're talking 1928 is when he graduated. He also got his master's degree the next year, but he was farming, though, at that time, too.
And tell me again where he went to college?
University of Illinois.
And he got his master's from there as well?
Yes.
Do you know what he would have majored in?
I believe he was an ag econ major.
Okay. Well, that makes perfect sense. That's following in the tradition of the family, isn't it?
Right, it is. Excuse me a minute.
Okay. And did he have any involvement with the bank side of the family business?
No, he did not. My grandfather, Bliss, continued to be on the board of directors and served at one time as president of the bank. But my grandparents, neither one of them were very enamored of being involved with the bank, so ultimately their interests were traded off for other assets. And one of my aunts did inherit some of the bank stock, but she eventually sold it too.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about when you and your other brothers and sisters came along.
I am the youngest, in spite of the fact that I have the whitest hair. But my oldest brother, Charles, was born in 1935. John and Paul were twins, born in 1937, and I was born in 1942. And we were all raised on the family farm.
Okay. Want to find out a little bit more about your father's early involvement with the Illinois Farm Bureau. If you can take us through that process.
Well, he had been involved with the County Farm Bureau and had worked, oh my goodness, he was, at that time, it was the Depression era. Excuse me.
These are very tough times for everybody.
Tough times, and Dad had just as tough a time as anyone. He did have an advantage in that there was more farm land for him to control, but it was difficult. And he and my mother married in 1933, and so, as I recall, they were just like any farmer in a lot of debt. They purchased a home to live in and some more acreage, and then not long after that, he purchased some more land from his grandmother, who was still living. So they had just as much a struggle. But he and my mother were very involved in and interested in helping farmers have a better life. In those days, you didn't have electricity. Very few had running water. None of the modern conveniences that we think of today. So one of the things that my father worked on was the rural electrification. He was involved with coal smeltery. That was pretty much through the Farm Bureau, got a committee together, as I recall him saying, to work on this. They started through Farm Bureau a marketing, the Illinois, or Moultrie County Livestock Marketing Association, a farm supply, which was an effort to get less expensive prices for products that the farmers needed. They got local insurance going. Some of this may have been going before then through Farm Bureau, but and then one of their main interests were improving our local county schools. Our little country schools were scattered. You know, every 2 miles there was a little one-room school, and he led the first consolidated school effort in our county. In fact, in central Illinois.
Well, I know that my understanding of the problems, the essential problems that agriculture in the United States had in the 20s and especially in the 30s, was the incredible bounty of the land, and the end result was you had this imbalance, a gross imbalance between supply and demand. So the farmers having bumper crops and they couldn't find a market for it, so the prices were very low.
Then they had droughts, and by the time they started to have some in the droughts, the government was trying to figure out how to keep farmers going, and free market essentially disappeared, is the way I understand it. And lots and lots of there's a lot of theories about why the Depression lasted as long as it did, and many of them believe that we would have snapped out of it quicker if the free market had been allowed to operate in all cases.
Well, many, and maybe especially your father.
Yes, especially my father.
Was that what drew him to the Farm Bureau work in the first place?
No, it was, I've talked to him about that. It was more, he wanted to help improve the local community, the local farming community.
So all these other things you're talking about, early involvement in REA, which was so important to these rural communities, and the grain elevator, and the livestock market. So being in the Illinois Farm Bureau was kind of a natural extension to that?
Yes, and he was a very young man, you see, doing all these things. He was just out of college.
Yeah.
And so he got to the attention, he became eventually the County Farm Bureau president, then he was selected as a district director, which put him on the Illinois Agricultural Association, or the Illinois State Farm Bureau Board. And then he became noticed there, of course, and became quite involved in more statewide events. And then eventually, in I believe it was 1948, I believe, he was selected as the Illinois Agricultural Association president, which changed his life, really, and changed the life of our family. I was just 6 years old when he was selected, as I recall, and that meant that he no longer could actively farm because the Illinois Agricultural Association offices were in Chicago, and it involved a full-time job. So he went to Chicago during the weekdays.
And this is obviously after the Depression, after the Second World War, at a time when farm market was quite different in terms of a rebuilding Europe.
Yes.
A foreign market was, I would think, much better in terms of farming at that time.
Yes, it was, but we still had government involvement, and so Dad had developed a free market philosophy before he became Illinois Farm Bureau president. He told me once that he attended there were some things called the Illinois Farmers Institute, and also one of his, that he attended religiously. They were informational meetings. And he became acquainted with also one of his professors at the U of I was very much economics professor, ag economics professor, influenced him a great deal about just the basic idea of the free market. He, at the time, of course, this was the time of Roosevelt and then later Truman, and he was very unusual because many farmers thought that the government had saved them from total disaster, and I don't doubt that it did in the programs. My dad's big gripe was that, yes, they stepped in when they were needed, but they never got out. And that's, and even today, we are still going.
Well, I'd like you, and maybe put you on the spot a little bit, describe a couple of these government programs that were involved with farming that, and then maybe that your father found especially distasteful.
Well, I'm not real up on things and his reaction to it, but I just do know from my general information that there were, to get rid of an oversupply of hogs, for instance, and farm animals, there was the effort, and it was actually done, and not taking those pigs to market, not selling them. The government purchased the hogs, and they were essentially not put on the market. The dumping of milk, I know that went on.
Just pouring it on the road.
Pouring it down the road. This was during the Depression. And it was, I think Dad's basic philosophy was, and this borne out by how he treated his neighbors. He believed that the common farmer had just as much sense about how he should run his life as some bureaucrat in Washington, which is the basic conservative philosophy, if you really get right down to it. A trust in the common man.
And a distrust in government?
And a belief that government is there as a backdrop, but not your sustainer. A person, an entity that, yes, maybe is a protective shield, but if you are protected too much, it's just as raising a child, you become just a servant or a slave. And that's really where he got it. But it comes from his absolute total trust of the common man, because they were his neighbors. He knew them. He knew who he was. He knew who his family were. He knew that these people, he worked with them day by day. They were not stupid people. They were not in their financial situation because of their stupidity. It was a temporary thing. And the thing that really, I think that's what drew people to Dad, because they recognized that he respected them. And that still is a theme of conservative thought.
Okay. We want to go a little bit, I want to go quite a bit more into the philosophy here, and we probably need to take a break here pretty soon. But lose my own train of thought to a certain extent. Your father wasn't shy to use terms like socialist in terms
Absolutely
of describing
not.
this relationship.
That's right. It was a very...
Outspoken?
They call him outspoken because there weren't very many people in those days calling a spade a spade. And he was not shy about controversy either.
And you expressed that he had developed these very strong views about where American agriculture was going even before he got to be president of the Illinois Farm Bureau.
Yes.
Was that those thoughts, his outspoken effort on behalf of farmers, what drove him to the presidency of the American Farm Bureau?
I can't, I know that by that time, yes, he was very committed to the whole concept of getting government away from involvement. When I say getting out of agriculture, he recognized that the government has a role in certain things, like supporting extension ideas or supporting research, safety, this kind of thing. But his problem was with their involvement in the pricing mechanisms, in dictating to farmers what they should or could plant and how much they should plant.
Well, I know part of the effort of the price supports was set-aside programs as well, convincing farmers who had land, don't plant that land, we'll pay you money for each bushel of corn that you might have produced.
That's right. And then also they stored up excess grain, and we used to have all these grain bins all over the country in the excess commodities, and that acted in and of itself acted as a depressant on the market. When you have a large supply, people knew the government had all this corn, and the market is not going to respond when there's a glut.
But if the market had played itself out and the government had gotten out of that business, then, you know, the problem with American agriculture is you've got 2 or 3 or 10 million farmers all producing the same thing, and they're producing as much as they can to make as much money as they can.
That's
and yet
right.
In the process of producing an incredible overabundance, the prices just collapse.
That's right, temporarily.
But
well, what happens? Are you a farmer? Do you know what happens when you have too many pigs, for instance? What do you do? You
drive out some of the people who are producing.
What do? You don't breed as many pigs next year. You cut back on your production naturally, and as a result, this is what we've lost. And even today, we don't understand that the free market is a self-regulating. Yes, there will be some people that go bankrupt. Do we have the same number of farmers as we did in 1930s now? What happened to them? We had government programs. They're not there, are they? I'm having an argument with you. So you can't say that government programs maintained or sustained farmers over the long haul. In fact, you can make a huge argument that they have encouraged, the government programs have encouraged the enlarging of farms, because even today there was always a support there. And you didn't have the natural give and take of the free market.
Well, this is wonderful, because we're getting to the very heart of these impassioned arguments that your father was right in the center of.
Yeah, I'll fight you about him anytime you want.
Betcha. That's just fine. The American Farm Bureau wasn't the only organization out there who were advocating, representing the American farmer, was it?
That's right. And we had a great deal of agitation through this whole period. And I'm moving up to the American Farm Federation.
And maybe what we should do is take a natural break here, and then we can get into talking in more detail about his time as the president itself.
Okay.
Okay?